We are going to start chapter 10. We'll finish chapter 10 on Friday, which means you have chapter 9 and 10 homework due on Sunday. So chapter 10, I would say, is the last of what I would consider the hard chapters in this class. Not that they're not all gonna have some difficulty, but I think that 8, 9, and 10 over the market structures are the most difficult. And so today we are going to, well, this chapter introduces us to 2 additional market structures for a total of 4. And today we are going to focus on the first of those 2, and then we're going to start to talk about the second one. We should have a little bit of time. But these market structures are going to be a tad more realistic. These market structures are going to be much more common than the other market structures that we've talked about. If we think about that spectrum of market structures from like monopoly on one end to perfect competition on the other, these lay somewhere in the middle. And I think for the most part, when you think about the markets you participate in as a consumer, it's going to be in one of these 2 basic market structures most of the time, okay? So the first one we're going to talk about is monopolistic competition. This is probably the most common market structure that we're going to face in reality. Monopolistic competition is really a hybrid market structure, okay? It is a market structure by definition or by attribute that would have many producers. Well, how many is many? So many that not one of them really matters or influences the market in any way. Everybody sort of gets lost in the crowd. There are low barriers to entry. It's easy to get into the market. It's easy to get out. Suppliers are selling slightly differentiated products. So we're all selling basically the same good, but somehow we've differentiated that good. And we'll talk, I have an entire slide on differentiation here in a minute, because it really is the big thing about this market structure. The interesting thing about this market structure is that differentiation that happens. Producers have some control over price. We consider them price makers. A price maker would have a downward sloping demand curve, okay? Some control over price, I say this because they still have competition. Producers in this market, remember there's many of them selling slightly differentiated products, they still have competition. So you can't just price wherever you want, right? It has to be in line somewhere with your competition, but you do have control over price to some extent. And suppliers act either independent or interdependent with other suppliers, depending on how closely their products resemble each other. Not all suppliers in this market are going to be in competition with all other suppliers in the market. There's usually going to be a handful that are selling something very similar to a very similar demographic. Interdependent means you pay close attention to what those competitors are doing. Independent means you don't care. So interdependent, paying close attention. Independent, those are suppliers you don't care about. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this monopolistic competition in terms of product differentiation. So I run into this all the time. Monopolistic competitive market structures. Most of the things I purchase are in these types of market structures. So I understand them. I understand how they work. When I first started teaching this class, I really began to observe economics in my daily life more and more and more because I talked about it and thought about it so much. A good example of a good in my real life in a monopolistically competitive market structure would be the gray hoodie. Because I had a kid 5 years ago, right, a teenager, who wanted to go to the mall and get a new gray hoodie. So we went to the mall, he picks one out, we go to Foot Locker, whatever, he picks one out, he throws one up on the counter, they ring it up, it's $87. And I'm like, wait a minute. But then quickly recognize I've got myself in a monopolistically competitive market structure, right? That product was different. There was something special about that version of the gray hoodie. It became really clear to me that not all gray hoodies are created equal, right? What was it about that one?
Santa Cruz was a champion brand.
Okay, so the brand, right? The brand. That's what was so special about that $87 hoodie, is that it had a little white swoosh on the chest, right? And that was enough to differentiate it to be able to charge a higher price, right? So let's talk about all of those different product differentiations that we see. We've broken it down into 4 basic categories. If you talk to somebody in marketing, they would probably break this out even more, right? The first is going to be physical differences. What is the color? What is the style? Is it physically better quality than another version on the market? That's going to be the first thing, right? The second one is going to be, and this one's very interesting to me, and it's spatial differentiation, which is basically, where's the product located at? Well, I can tell you that the Starbucks located right next to the College of Business could charge me a higher price because it's where I need it, when I need it, it's right there. The location works for me. There are businesses that operate on the periphery of campus. And it is that spatial differentiation that allows them to be your go-to if you're living on campus for your slice of pizza, your cup of coffee, your groceries, whatever, right? Those of you who attend any or did attend any, major sporting event, that same beer, right, that would cost you less than $1 at the grocery store is now $10 inside the ballpark. It's the same exact thing, but it's located in the ballpark. So now it's worth $10, right? That's spatial differentiation. That same hot dog, right, is available outside the ballpark, probably from a vendor, probably right outside the ballpark for a fraction of the cost it's going to charge you inside. A bottle of water at Disneyland, come on, right? That's going to be $5 or $6, right? It costs you 19 cents at Sam's Club. So it just simply has to do with the location. The products might be identical, but the location is what differentiates that product, okay? Services. Again, you might have exactly the same product, and maybe the service that you provide that goes along with that product is what differentiates it. So this could be customer service. This could be return policies. This could be any of that stuff. If you warranty your product for 30 days or 90 days or whatever, that could be that thing, okay, that differentiates you. And then product image, right? This is what I paid $87 for. Is the advertising, the promotion that went along with the Nike brand, that for some reason convinced my kid it was worth more, which convinced me it was worth more, right? And I bought it. And companies spend a lot of money differentiating in that way. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you think about Nike and you think about a Nike gray hoodie, Nike is independent of a lot of other gray hoodie producers, but it is also interdependent with a lot of gray hoodie producers. Which other producers of the gray hoodie is Nike acting interdependent with? Which other producers do they care about?
So when they merchandise, the people that bought it from stitch on the logo, but independent of like the people who spun the thread.
Okay, so you're talking about the
Sorry,
different
thinking out loud.
stages of production. No, that's okay. But what about the final product?
Like Under Armour.
So we have an Under Armour.
Who
Yeah,
else?
there's
Yeah,
one other one.
Adidas or something like that.
Say it again.
Adidas.
Adidas, thank you. That's the other one I was thinking of. So I would say Nike, Under Armour, and Adidas are interdependent in terms of the way that they compete. Nike does not care about the gray hoodie being sold at Walmart or at Target or, right? They don't care about those. They would be independent of those ones. Now, here's where the monopolistic part comes in. This is why it's monopolistic competition. Is anybody other than Nike allowed to sell a gray sweatshirt with a little white swoosh at the top?
Not legally.
Not legally, thank you.
No.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Mitchell. China, I guess, is technically allowed to do it, right? Because they're not governed by US law. But for the most part, right, that would be illegal. Nike has a monopoly on gray hoodies with white swooshes. They have a monopoly on that. There is a legal restriction that keeps US manufacturers from producing that thing. But that little monopoly, Nike, also has to compete with other monopolies like Adidas, like Under Armour. So it's this hybrid, right? And if you look at the clothes you're wearing, I hope you all are wearing clothes, but I guess I'll never know. The clothes you're wearing, or the backpack that you carry, or the handbag, or the pair of shoes you have on, or next to your bed, or the water bottle next to your bed, or whatever, most of those goods came from monopolistically competitive market structures, okay? It's probably going to be your most common one. All right, so let's talk about the graphs. Here's the beautiful thing about monopolistic competition, if you've seen it all before. You've seen all of these graphs before. You've seen all of these slides before when we have referred to other market structures. It is monopolistic competition. It is a hybrid market structure, okay? So in the short run, you've seen this all before. This is actually the third time you're gonna see this. We profit maximize where MR equals MC. Well, that's where we always profit maximize, right? At the quantity in which marginal revenue was equal to marginal cost. We find the price up on our downward sloping demand curve, okay? If price is greater than ATC, we're earning a profit. If ATC is greater than price is greater than ATC. I actually think I copied this from the last chapter, word for word. We're experiencing an economic loss, and we will continue to produce in the short run. But if the price is less than our AVC, which means our average variable cost is always above our demand curve, we experience an economic loss, and we should shut down in the short run. This is, like I said, you've seen it twice now. Okay, this is the third time you will have seen this information. This is just that analysis that we do to figure out if we should continue to operate. Are we covering our variable and any portion of our fixed? Well, then we should continue to operate. If we're not even covering our variable or the new costs we're amassing as we continue to produce and buy resources, well, then we should shut down, right? At least in the short run. Now, the long run gives us opportunities to make all sorts of new decisions. So even if you shut down in the short run, the long run could be different for you, right? We don't know. The long run's too far off. There's too many variables. There's too many other things we need to talk about, okay? Here's my little sort of cheat for remembering how to analyze monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition first looks like a monopoly. So in the short run, it looks like a monopoly. Everything's the same. The graphs are the same. The analysis is the same. Profits the same. Everything's the same. But in the long run or second, it looks like perfect competition. Monopolistic competition looks like a monopoly, then it looks like perfect competition. Okay? All right. So if you understood those two, so if you're good on chapters 8 and 9, there's really not a lot new to learn about monopolistic competition. It's just remembering this. Okay? All right. So let's look at our graphs. You've seen these graphs before, right? We're talking about the short run. So these graphs look like monopoly. Yep, these are probably the exact same graphs, same colors, same lines, same everything as you saw in the last chapter, in chapter 9, okay? So, but I think it always benefits us to go through these again, okay? So in this first graph, we have our downward sloping demand curve, our marginal revenue line that sits under the demand curve. That looks like monopoly, but we're talking about monopolistic competition. We find MR equals MC, step 1. Step 2, go up, find your demand curve. That'll give us our price, or P, over here on the y-axis. Then I need to find my ATC, which is step 3. Step 3, ATC is below price. That's a good thing, right? Trace that over to the y-axis. We have our cost per unit and our price per unit. The difference between these two is our profit per unit. Profit per unit times the quantity is going to give us the value of that entire blue shaded area, which is total profit, okay? Again, you saw this in the last chapter. This second one, right, this is a slightly different scenario. We find our MR equals MC, step 1. Step 2, we go find the price. That's up here at point B, price per unit. Then I go find my ATC. Oops, it's above my price. I already know I'm losing money, right? Here's the area of my loss, this pink or orange in here, right? My loss per unit is the difference between the price and the cost over here on the y-axis, multiplied by my profit maximizing quantity is going to give me the value of that shaded area, which is my total loss. Should I, somebody at home, should I continue to operate or should I shut down in the short run?
Continue to operate.
That is right. Continue to operate. Thank you. We are covering our variable and some portion of our fixed, right? Up to point B. We're covering all those costs. Continue to operate in the short run. Who knows what you do in the long run? Cayman, that's a good question. How come AVC is not included in the left graph? Because AVC, and it's just because we didn't need it. We could have put it on there. Definitely could have put it on there. But when you're making a profit, AVC is not even a consideration because you're not trying to figure out if you're covering AVC. If you're making a profit, it doesn't matter. So Cayman, it was just keeping that simple, that first graph simple, because we actually didn't need AVC for our analysis. But it could be there, right? Because we do have an AVC. Yeah. I hope that answers the question. All right. Any questions about this? All right. We've done it before, right? Okay. So now let's talk about the long run. Well, I already told you what this should look like in the long run. It should go back to chapter 8, what perfectly competitive firms experienced in the long run, which was zero economic profit, right? So this again should look familiar. We're going back to chapter 8 here, all right? So if we are earning short run economic profits, firms are going to be attracted to that. And because we are in a market structure where firms can come and go fairly easily, it's easy to get into the gray hoodie market, right? That's not a hard thing. I could start sewing them today, right? If someone sees that there is a lot of profit in that market, they're going to want a piece of it, okay? Especially somebody who's already producing clothing anyway. They're just going to divert some resources. So new firms will enter the market in the long run, which will pull some of the existing consumers away from other firms, which will shift the demand curve to the left for the existing firms who are already in the market, so bringing their demand down, and their price is going to go down, equilibrium price is going to go down, and those profits are going to disappear in the long run. They're going to end up at zero economic profit. So you're saying, wait a minute, you're telling me Nike experiences zero economic profit in the long run? That's exactly what I'm saying. Every resource you use to produce something could have been used for something else. So this is about opportunity cost. This is just fundamental economics, right? The accountants at Nike are showing profits, guaranteed, right? It is the economic side of it, right, that says there's no profit there from an economic perspective. Okay, the millions, the tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars spent by Nike in sponsorships and advertising could have been spent on something else, right? There's an opportunity cost involved. And so it's about those opportunity costs. So don't overthink it, just accept it as fundamental economics, okay? All right. If we're experiencing losses, right? In the long run, if we're experiencing short run losses, in the long run, we would expect firms to leave that market when they got to the end of the short run, which means that when firms leave a market, their customers, those consumers left behind by that supplier, have to shift to other suppliers, which increases, right, the demand curve for those other suppliers. And their slightly different version of the product that shifts the demand curve to the right. That's going to increase the price, the equilibrium price of those goods, and that loss is going to disappear. And again, we're going to be back at zero economic profit. So our graphs look like monopoly in the short run. We can experience profits or losses like monopoly in the short run. In the long run, it goes back to those perfectly competitive, sort of the perfectly competitive attribute of firms being able to enter and exit, and that's what erases in the long run profits and losses, and we end up with zero economic profit. Everybody good? All right. So this, you've seen this before too, right? You saw something like this. Actually, no, you didn't, sorry. This is gonna be you saw something similar, not exactly like this when we talked about perfect competition, but we're gonna do a little comparison here in a minute. But this is what long run equilibrium for monopolistic competition would look like. And when I talk about long run equilibrium, I talk about those zero economic profit sort of situations in long run equilibrium. And all this is saying, all you're seeing here is that at MR equals MC, which is the best we can do, right? The best quantity we have for profit maximizing or loss minimizing, we are only covering our costs. So best case scenario happens at point A, MR equals MC. If we go up to the demand curve in the ATC, they are tangent, they are equal. We're not making any economic profit. So it's just what we said. We're doing the best we can, and in the long run, we're still gonna see zero economic profit. Don't overthink that. This is just the visual of that. All right, we're gonna do a little bit of a comparison between monopolistic competition and perfect competition, because there's definitely some things to talk about, some good comparisons that we can do. So this first slide is their similarities, and I actually probably should have put the word similarities on here, I did not. I don't know why, but I would add that just so you're not confused, because then we'll do some slides about the differences. This one's the similarities. So the similarity between monopolistic competition and perfect competition has a lot to do with the long run, right? It has to do with that zero economic profit piece in the long run. Well, another similarity, which is actually a similarity of all market structures, is that we go looking for MR equals MC to find our profit maximizing quantity, okay? Nothing complicated there. It's the short run stuff that creates the differences, right? It's the short run piece that's the differences. It's the long run piece in which they have the similarities. So perfect competition, how is it different? What is very particular? Well, it's the short run stuff, right? It's the firm demand curve is a horizontal line. It produces at a minimum average cost. We do get costs down to its minimum under perfect competition. It forces us to. And it's a very efficient market. Produces a lot of consumer surplus, keeps prices low, keeps production high, gives the consumers what they want at a very productively efficient cost and resource usage, okay? Again, we've talked about these things, but it's just thinking about them again in the context of a comparison.
Was that page similarity as well?
No, this is going to be different. This is what is, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. This is what is sort of different about perfect competition or unique about it. Yep, thank you. And then the next one is what's unique about monopolistic competition as compared to perfect, right? That it has a downward sloping demand curve. It's all of this short run stuff, okay? Because that's where they're different. Downward sloping demand curve, they don't produce at a minimum average cost, meaning they have excess capacity. Excess capacity means you could produce more. But under monopolistic competitive market structures, we typically get less goods at higher prices because firms can do that differentiation. And if they can do that differentiation and convince somebody to pay a higher price because of that difference, any one of those four, right, categories of difference, all they have to do is convince us it's worth more, and then we'll pay for it. And then they don't produce as much at a higher price, erodes consumer surplus, right? And they definitely spend more to differentiate their product. Under perfect competition, we said there was no competition, right? There was no differentiation. There was no spending on marketing, advertising. There wasn't a reason to, because it's perfect competition. We all get the same price no matter what. So why would we spend the extra money trying to differentiate when there was no difference, right? Yeah. So this is what would be unique compared to perfect competition. I'll give you guys just a minute here. All right, and this next slide is just going to compare long-run equilibriums. We know that in the end, right, they experience zero economic profit. They do look similar in the end. This is how the graphs might be different. You've seen this first one before when we talked about perfect competition. This is the same thing. This is MR equals MC equals price equals cost, all happening with the same quantity. So essentially just, it's the best we can do and it zeroes out, zero economic profit. And then here's the one you just saw that I showed you a few slides ago. MR equals MC, it's the best we can do, but we're barely, right? We're just making zero economic profit. The comparison, when you look at it, and I know it's not really easy to see, but if you look closely, you can see that the quantity is lower under monopolistic competition and the price is higher, right? The price is higher and the quantity is lower. You still end up at MR equals MC and price equals ATC, but it just happens at a lower quantity and a higher price under monopolistic competition. Good? That's it for monopolistic competition, okay? Which is the third of our market structures. We're gonna start on the fourth one here in a second. But any questions about monopolistic competition? All right, I'm gonna switch over PowerPoints real quick. And we're gonna start on the fourth and final of your market structures, which is the oligopoly market structure. Now this one's gonna get kind of interesting. When we talk about oligopolies, we're not gonna spend a lot of time looking at graphs and looking at HECs and MCs and all of that, because this is gonna look similar to monopolistic competition and monopoly, because we are gonna talk about price makers here. So the graphs, it would just be using the same graphs for the third time. What's interesting about the oligopoly market structure is the way that firms in this market structure interact with one another. And it brings us into the concept of game theory. And so what we're really gonna talk about after I do a short explanation today is on Friday, we're gonna talk more about the game theory that goes along with being a participant in this market structure. So this one's gonna feel different because we're not doing all the crazy like graph, short run, long run, because it would all look the same as the stuff under monopolistic competition. What makes this one unique is the type of competition or collusion that we would see in this type of market structure, okay? Oligopoly market structure, by definition, is going to have a few firms in the market. Well, how many is a few? Well, I don't know. Not very many, right? So few that each firm and the decisions and the actions of each firm actually have impact on the market. My best number range is going to be something like 3 to 10, 3 to 12, something in that range. It's definitely not 2, because that's a different market structure that we're not really going to talk about. But it's definitely 3, and I would say probably goes up to 10 or 12. And that would be the typical range of producers in an oligopoly market structure. Firms behave interdependent. No matter what you're producing or who you are in this market, whether you're the biggest firm in the market or the smallest firm in the market, there is some interdependence. There's just so few producers that you have to pay attention to every single one of your competitors because they're all important. Their actions are all important and impactful on the market, okay? The more similar your products, the more similar your product to another firm in the oligopoly market structure, the greater that interdependence is going to be. There is going to be typically some differentiation, okay? But we actually, in this market structure, we actually have undifferentiated oligopoly markets and differentiated oligopoly markets. So within the oligopoly market structure, you actually can have a market that is undifferentiated and one that's differentiated. Undifferentiated is pretty rare. Most of the time you're going to see differentiated, which I have a whole slide on that next. But an undifferentiated oligopoly would be an oligopoly selling a commodity. So a handful of firms all selling identical units of a good or a commodity. One of the best examples I could probably come up with for this would be like the US petroleum market or oil producing market. You don't have a ton of oil producers in the world, actually, but you definitely don't have a lot in the US. They're selling a commodity. You and I don't pull up to a gas station or look at a barrel of oil and really differentiate between a gallon of regular gasoline at one gas station or a gallon at another. Like you and I we don't differentiate that way. So I would say that might be an example of an undifferentiated oligopoly would be the US oil market, okay? Now, if you're buying premium oil, that's different.
Would you consider like Google or Bing in this sort of market?
Oh, like search engines?
Yeah, because there's not a lot of them. Like
There's
the only
not
ones
a
I
lot
know
of
are,
them.
Like Bing or Yahoo.
I like it. I like it. They're definitely going to be differentiated, right? So they're going to be part of our next slide, and I'm going to be looking for examples, but that's a good one. Okay. So let's talk about differentiated oligopolies, much more common. Okay. And so one of the examples here in the classroom was search engines, right? Google, Bing, whatever. Definitely an oligopoly market structure. Selling about the same thing with a few differences. And you, as the consumer, notice those differences and get to make those choices. So an oligopoly sells a slightly, in a differentiated oligopoly, sells a slightly differentiated product, differentiated for one of those 4 reasons we already discussed. I want some more examples.
Cell phones.
Cell phone service, good.
Or the phone makers themselves.
Or the phone makers themselves, thank you. Another good one. Those of you at home, I want a couple examples of differentiated oligopolies, actual examples of markets. There's several out there.
Computers.
Computers, thank you.
Streaming
What else? Gas stations, thank you, yep.
Well, there's probably more than 12 like in the world, but car makers.
Car manufacturers, that's actually a good example. Yeah, my number 12, I mean,
In the US, that's probably about what you
in the US, yeah, probably. Appliances, thank you, Logan, that's a great one. Appliances, I would say airlines, airplane manufacturers, right? Very many of those. Go ahead.
Hard copy books.
Say it one more time.
Hard copy books.
Hard copy books, yeah, so like publishers, awesome. Video game consoles, that's a great example, right? These are all oligopoly market structures who have differentiated their product, set their own pricing schedules within reason, right? They have to be a little more careful. It's because you can't go crazy on price because you actually do have very strong competitors who have similar pricing schemes. So you can't get too crazy, right? Yeah, all good examples. So you can see how between monopolistically competitive market structures and oligopoly, especially differentiated oligopolies, that really is a bulk of the products you and I buy are out of those market structures, okay? One of the big things about the oligopoly market structure that makes it different than monopolistic competition or monopoly in terms of like attributes, right? A lot of the attributes are going to be the same, downward sloping demand curve, right? Is going to be barriers to entry. I know that under the monopoly market structure, we talked about barriers to entry. What keeps that monopolist isolated? Well, in the oligopoly market structure, you can have similar barriers to entry, but there are some more. And that is really one of the interesting things, the interesting differences to talk about with the oligopoly market structure. Yeah, we have legal restrictions and control over a central resource, which were the same under monopoly. But I think one of the big ones is economies of scale. Now, let's remind ourselves what economies of scale is, right? It is driving down the cost per unit the more units you make. If you are coming into the video game console industry, the appliance industry, the automobile manufacturing industry, those are big ones. The upfront capital investment that you have to make to start up an automobile plant? I mean, it's got to be $1 billion, right? If not hundreds of millions of dollars. How many automobiles do you have to crank out of that facility to start to experience economies of scale? You have this huge pool of fixed costs that you have to get thinned out and distributed amongst more and more and more units to get to the point where you're actually making any money. It's probably why we don't see a lot of new video game consoles, a lot of new car manufacturers, is because of this economies of scale piece, okay? It sort of keeps that market, that oligopoly market structure sort of confined, keeps it an oligopoly. So that's this high cost of entry, sort of doubles back to that economies of scale, right? High startup costs, you are competing with brand names, established brands that have been around decades, if not 100 or more years, right? Especially in some of these big, the automobile industry. Some of them have been around since the beginning. And then there's this last one, which is a little bit more sinister, if you will. And it's a practice called crowding out the competition. It's done all the time. It's highly illegal, but it is very, very difficult to pinpoint, to trace, and to prove. So crowding out the competition is actually something that happens when the firms, the old firms, the existing firms in the market, the ones that have been around a while, sort of band together, sort of gang up on any new firms that want to enter the market. And they have a lot of power. And the way that they can crowd out their competition is A, to really ramp up advertising of their own, or to decide momentarily that they're going to decrease the price of their good. Now, when you do those two things as an existing firm in the market, you make it a lot more difficult from the new firm coming in to get over that hurdle of economies of scale and high startup costs and brand names. And it becomes really easy to keep new firms from entering the market because A, it's just difficult to begin with. And then if all of the competitors in the market sort of gang up on you, it would be almost impossible. And it's also impossible to prove, for the government to prove that that's what's happening. How do they know why you cut your prices or ramped up your marketing? They don't know, right? You could be trying to compete with one another, the existing firms in the market. They don't know. There's nothing they can prove. So it's another barrier to entry.
Is there a name for when they would like purchase or like acquire another company? So let's say I'm starting to start up and then I get bought out by
Like a merger?
yeah,
or,
like they
yeah.
buy my company so that I'm no longer correct.
Oh, is that a thing?
Is that the same as crowding out?
I think it's a little different than crowding out. It ends up probably with the same outcome in the end, like buying up a smaller company. Yeah. So this next slide is just sort of illustrating that economies of scale thing, which is really the big issue in this type of a market structure. This S down here along the x-axis stands for small company. The M is for medium-sized company. And then here's a long-run average cost curve that we assume would apply to both of them. So in this case, we're talking about an automobile manufacturer. A small company would still only be producing and selling a very small unit of cars. And so their cost per unit would be extremely high up there at point A. And a medium-sized factory who had been in business a while, who had brand name recognition and had achieved more of an economies of scale or a cost per unit down here at point B, would be much better in terms of economies of scale. So that small firm has to overcome a huge gap, getting brand recognition, ramping up advertising, spending money on advertising, trying to thin out all of that fixed or startup cost between more units. you can just see it's a huge gap to try and close. All right, so we have time, I think, to do one more slide. Now, I told you the interesting thing about this type of market structure is that firms, because of the interdependence, have a choice. And that is to compete with one another on a really competitive sort of scale, like in terms of pricing and marketing and advertising, and they can really compete, or they actually have the opportunity to collude, work together. Because there's so few of them, the probability that they could get everyone in terms of suppliers in that market on the same page and have some really good collusive activities that profit maximize for everybody is pretty high likelihood. And we do see it happen. And again, it's incredibly hard to prove. And so they can be successful at it. Two of the biggest ways that we see this collusion happening is with price fixing. Like, we all agree. So there's three of us in the market, and the three of us informally get together and agree that we're not going to drop our prices below a certain level. Well, that increases profits for everybody. The other way that we see collusion happening is something called dividing markets. So, like, there's three of us, and I'll take the eastern part of the United States, you take the western part, you take the central states. We divide up the market, or you take the commercial market, I'll take the residential market, or whatever, right? We decide to set it up so that we don't end up competing with one another. Well, how's the government supposed to come in and say, you know, especially if I'm located in the East, how are they supposed to say to me, you're colluding because you're not advertising in the West? Well, I'm in the East. These are my people, right? I keep transportation costs low. I keep, you know, whatever. I understand the market better because it's where I'm located. It's a really hard thing to prove. And then that brings us to the ultimate in collusion, and that is cartels. Now, cartels are illegal here in the US, so we really don't see them here, but we see them in other parts of the world. What's the big cartel we talk about? Drug cartels. Yeah. So, you know, the reason cartels work is because there is a party who forces it to work. Cartels are basically a form of firm in which we take all producers and we funnel all production to one central distribution. The cartel form doesn't work unless you can force parties, producers to agree to funnel all production to one central distributor. That central distributor then decides what price that good gets sold at on the market, and really decides quantity too. Decides how much quantity is going to be released to the market and at what price. And, you know, when we talk about drug cartels, you know, the Mexican drug cartel is really the cartel that is dominant right now. Before that, it was the Colombian drug cartel. Those cartels aren't, it's not that they're legal in Mexico or they were legal in Colombia, but they just don't have the infrastructure to keep that from occurring. The Colombian drug cartel was really the cartel that funneled all the drugs through sort of the seaports in Miami, which once the US government decided they weren't going to allow that to happen anymore, right? They were pretty effective in keeping the drugs out of Miami or coming through Miami as a central port for all those drugs. But now it's coming across the US-Mexico border. It's still, a lot of it's Colombian drugs, right? Still a lot of cocaine from Colombia is now just being funneled through the Mexican border, which seems to be a whole lot less easy to regulate. The proximity is just a lot closer to the US. And the US government has decided, for whatever reason, not to divert resources from other things to tackling that cartel activity. But it's really the ultimate in coordinated production, and actually allows many producers to act as one firm, essentially monopolizing a market. Okay? I'm out of time. All right, that's all I have for today. We'll finish this up on Friday. Everybody have a good one.